Clara Vance looked like she was about to let the wind take her. That was my first thought when I saw her out in the north pasture, struggling with an old mule that had decided the middle of a gathering gale was the perfect place to contemplate the horizon. Her wool coat was held together at the collar by a rusted brass safety pin, and her hair, which was usually pinned up in a neat, sensible knot, had come loose, whipping across her face in dark, wet streaks. She was 34 years old, though the plains had a way of adding 5 years to a person's face if they spent too much time looking at the sky and wondering when the rain would stop, or when the snow would start. The mule, whose name was Barnaby, and who possessed the stubbornness of a limestone ledge, had his front hooves planted in the frozen mud. He was not budging, not for Clara, and certainly not for the white wall of the storm that was rolling down from the bighorns like a spilled load of flour. A man who spends his life on a horse learns to read the sky the way a banker reads a ledger. I knew by the copper smell in the air and the way my gelding was shivering under his saddle that we had about 20 minutes before the world turned entirely white. I rode down the draw, the wind already biting through my sheepskin coat, and took the lead rope from her hands without asking. She did not argue. Her fingers were the color of raw beef, stiff and useless from the cold. She had left her mittens on the kitchen table, or perhaps she did not own a pair that didn't have more holes than wool. We did not make it back to her cabin. The wind came first, a high, thin whistle that turned into a roar within 300 yards, and then the snow hit us sideways. It was the kind of storm that makes a man forget which way his boots are pointed. The only thing within reach was the old line shack on the boundary line between her 30 acres and the cattle company's winter range. It was a 12 by 12 box of rough sawn pine, built by some drift fence riders 10 years back and left to the pack rats. We scrambled through the door just as the horizon disappeared completely. Inside, the air was cold enough to freeze the breath in your throat, but it was dry. There was a small cast iron stove in the corner, a pile of dry cedar chunks that some kind-hearted hand had left behind, and a single wooden chair with a broken rung. Clara stood by the door, shivering so hard her teeth made a clicking sound like dry pine needles in a breeze. She looked at the single room, at the narrow bunk in the corner with its bare straw mattress, and then she looked at me. A woman alone on the plains is a target for advice she never asked for, and help she cannot afford. She knew, and I knew, what the town of Oakhaven would say if they found out she had spent a night in a one-room shack with a hired hand from the Circle 9. It did not matter that the thermometer was dropping past 0, or that the wind outside would have stripped the skin off a beef in an hour. Reputation was a fragile thing, easily broken and very difficult to glue back together. I did not say anything to her. I went to my saddle, which I had hauled inside, and untied my bedroll. I pulled out my old gray wool army blanket. It had a faded blue stripe down the center and smelled of cedar shavings and horse sweat. I took 2 fencing staples from my coat pocket, found a heavy pine knot in the ceiling beam, and hammered them in with the heel of my boot. I hung the blanket from the beam, dividing the small room into 2 perfect halves. The stove and the single chair were on her side. The door, the cold draft, and the bare dirt floor by the saddle were on mine. That was the first thing she noticed. She did not say thank you, but she stopped shivering, and she sat down on the chair by the stove while I started the fire. The cedar caught quickly, filling the small space with a scent of sweet smoke and old dust. The stovepipe began to draw, humming a low tune as the draft took hold. Through the gray wool of the blanket, I could see the orange glow of the stove grate reflecting off her skirt. "You have the wood side," I told her, sitting down on my saddle with my back against the log wall. "I will keep the draft from coming under the door." I heard her move her chair closer to the iron. The wind hit the side of the shack with a sound like a heavy sack of grain being dropped on the roof. "Thank you, Jessie," she said. Her voice was quiet, muffled by the heavy wool between us. We stayed like that for the first 12 hours, two strangers divided by 5 pounds of gray sheep's wool, listening to the winter try to tear the roof off our heads. The second day began before the sun was even up, though there was no sun to speak of. Only a pale gray light that filtered through the greasepaper window on Clara's side of the blanket. The wind had not let up. It had settled into a steady, flat roar that made the pine logs groan in their notches. Barnaby the mule was in the lean-to behind the shack, and every hour or so he would let out a sound like a dry pump handle being dragged up and down. He was not pleased with the accommodations, but he was alive, which was more than could be said for any stock left out on the flats. Clara was awake first. I heard her moving the small cedar blocks, placing them into the stove with a soft, clicking precision. She was a neat woman, even in a drafty shack with 3 days of snow on the shingles. "I have some salt pork in my pocket," she said through the blanket, "and 2 biscuits from yesterday morning. They are hard as river stones, but they will soften in some water." I reached under my saddle and pulled out my tin cup and a small pouch of coffee beans that had been crushed with the butt of my revolver. "I have the coffee," I said. "If you can slide the kettle over the top of the stove, I will pass the cup under the blanket." There was a 3-inch gap between the bottom of the army blanket and the dirt floor. I watched her hand reach through. It was a small hand, scarred across the knuckles from some old kettle burn, and her fingers were still red from the cold. I placed the tin cup in her palm, careful not to let my fingers brush hers. Respect moved between us quietly through what was observed and never needed saying. We ate our breakfast in silence, listening to the mule groan. By noon, the silence had grown too heavy for the small room. When you are trapped in a space that small, with nothing but the sound of the wind to keep you company, your own thoughts can start to feel like enemies. "How is your woodpile back at the house, Clara?" I asked. I had been working for the Circle 9 for 2 years, and I had passed her place dozens of times. I knew her woodpile was small. I had seen her out there with a dull, double-bit axe, swinging with more determination than weight, trying to make firewood out of old fence posts. "It will last through November," she said after a long pause. "If I am careful, if I only keep the stove going in the mornings." Pride is a cold bedfellow when the wind comes out of the north. She said it as if it were a common thing, as if every woman in the territory spent her winters shivering under 3 quilts until noon to save a nickel's worth of cottonwood. "I can split some of that oak down by the creek for you when the snow clears," I said. "It is too heavy for a light axe, but a wedge will open it up." "You have your own work, Jessie," she said. "Mr. Miller does not pay you to split wood for widows." "Mr. Miller does not pay me to freeze to death in his line shacks either," I said. "But here we are. He can spare a half day." She did not answer right away. I heard her move her tin cup against the iron stove. "My husband, Thomas, always said that a man who offers to help a woman for nothing is usually looking for something she is not prepared to sell," she said. The words were hard, but they did not have any anger in them. They were just the dry truth of a woman who had lived with a difficult man in a difficult country. Thomas Vance had been a sour individual, a farmer who tried to grow wheat where God had clearly intended for nothing but grass and jackrabbits to live. He had died of the lung fever 2 winters back, leaving her with 30 acres of clay, a half-dozen scrub cows, and a pile of debts at the mercantile that would have turned a stronger person's hair white. "Thomas was a hard judge of people," I said, keeping my voice level. "He was a hard judge of everything," she said. "Mostly himself." The wind took that comment and carried it away, whistling through the gaps in the doorframe. I reached down and stuffed a piece of dried burlap into a corner, where the snow was beginning to sift through in a fine white line. "It took him 4 years to build the kitchen on our house," she said, her voice softer now, almost as if she were talking to the stove rather than to me. "He would not let anyone help him, not even the neighbors when they offered a raising. He said if he could not do it himself, he did not deserve the room. We lived in a sod house with a dirt roof that leaked mud into my flour bin every time it rained. I used to sit under an umbrella while I made the bread." The image of her sitting under an umbrella in a sod house, kneading dough with mud dripping around her, was something I had not expected. I let out a short, dry laugh before I could stop myself. Through the blanket there was a pause, and then I heard her laugh too. It was a quiet sound, like water running over gravel under a thin skim of ice. "It was not funny then," she said. "No, I suppose not," I said. "But it is now." "It is," she agreed. The tension that had stayed in the room since we first hammered the staples into the pine beam seemed to ease a little. The blanket was still there, a thick gray wall between us, but it did not feel so much like a barrier anymore. It felt more like a roof we were both sitting under. By the second night, the cold had crept deep into the floor. The dirt had frozen solid, and even with the cedar fire going, the corners of the shack were white with frost. I had my sheepskin coat wrapped around my shoulders, but my feet were numb inside my riding boots. On the other side of the blanket, Clara was quiet. I could hear her shifting on the narrow bunk, trying to find a position that kept her off the cold wood. "Jessie," she said. "Yes, Clara. Do you ever think about going back east?" I looked up at the ceiling, where the frost had formed in the shape of small pine trees. I had left Missouri when I was 18, with nothing but an old cavalry saddle and a horse that had a bad habit of biting anyone who tried to girth him. "Sometimes," I said, "when the wind is like this. But there is nothing there for me now. The farm was sold after the war. My sister went to Illinois with her husband, and I do not even know the name of the people who live in our old house. My family had an orchard in Ohio," she said, "apple trees. In the spring, the smell of the blossoms was so thick you could taste it in the well water. My mother had a parlor with a carpet that had red roses woven into it. I thought I would have a parlor like that one day." "You still might," I said. "No," she said, and her voice had that flat, plains certainty to it again. "The bank in town does not care about apple blossoms, Jessie. They care about the $20 I owe them on the 1st of the month. If I do not have it, they will take the 30 acres and sell it to the railway company for a gravel pit." I lay there, listening to the small clinking of the stove as the wood burned down to coal. I had $80 saved up in an old tobacco tin under my bunk at the Circle 9 bunkhouse. It was 2 years of work, of riding line in the sleet, of branding calves in the dust, of eating beans that had more gravel in them than pork. It was my horse money. I wanted to buy a small cabin on the North Fork of the Powder River, a place where the water ran clear and a man did not have to take orders from anyone who had never spent a night in a saddle. "It is a hard country for a woman alone," I said. "It is a hard country for anyone who does not have a partner," she said. "Thomas always said that a partner is just another mouth to feed, another person to let you down when the snow gets deep. But I think he was wrong about that." I did not answer. I could not. The wind had dropped for a moment, and the silence in the room was so complete I could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of the mule in the lean-to. "He was wrong about a lot of things," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The next morning, the 3rd day, the wind was gone. The silence that woke us was louder than the gale had been. It was that heavy, muffled quiet that only comes when there are 3 feet of fresh drift outside the door. I stood up, my knees cracking like dry twigs, and pushed the door open. The snow had drifted halfway up the frame, a solid wall of sparkling white that caught the first pink light of the morning. We had to dig our way out with the single broken shovel that sat in the corner of the shack. It was hard, slow work, and by the time we had cleared a path to the lean-to, my coat was wet through with sweat and my hands were raw. Barnaby the mule came out of the shed with his head down, looking at us as if the whole thing were our fault. He had a layer of frost on his ears, and his breath came out in long white plumes that hung in the still air. We did not talk much on the ride back to her cabin. The horses struggled through the drifts, their bellies plowing through the soft white powder, while the sun rose higher, turning the plains into a sea of blinding light that hurt the eyes. When we reached her gate, the chimney of her small cabin was cold. The place looked small and lonely against the white expanse of the prairie, a single dark speck in a world that had been washed clean of everything else. I got down from my saddle and opened the gate for her. She rode her horse through, then stopped and looked down at me. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but she did not look defeated. She looked like someone who had survived. "Thank you, Jessie," she said. "I will be back with that axe tomorrow," I told her. She looked at her cabin, then back at me. "I do not have any money to pay you," she said. "I did not ask for any," I said. The next morning, the first hard frost of November had turned the creek banks into silver lace. I did not ask Mr. Miller for the afternoon off. I simply saddled my horse, tied my splitting wedge and my 5-pound beetle to the saddle strings, and rode out toward the Vance place before the sun had cleared the ridge. When I arrived, she was already out by the woodpile. She was wearing that same wool coat with the brass safety pin, and she had a rusty crosscut saw laid across a log of cottonwood. She looked up when my horse clicked against the stones of the dry wash. "You are early," she said. "The wood does not get any softer as the day goes on," I said. I got down, tied my horse to her hitching post, and took the saw from her hand. It was dull enough to ride to town on, the teeth clogged with old resin, and the blade rusted to a dark, pitted brown. "Where is your file?" I asked. "Thomas kept his tools in the tin box under the kitchen table," she said, "but he did not like anyone touching them. Thomas is not using them today," I said. She went inside and brought out the file. It was a good one, an 8-inch flat bastard that had been kept dry in an oily rag. I sat down on a chopping block and spent 30 minutes jointing and filing the saw, the small silver filings falling into the white dust at my feet. She stood by the kitchen door, watching me work with her hands tucked into her sleeves. "You do not move like a man who is in a hurry," she observed. "A man in a hurry makes mistakes," I told her, without looking up from the steel. "In this country, a mistake usually means you lose a finger or a horse. Neither one of those grows back. That is what my father used to say," she said. "He spent 30 years in the orchard. He said you could tell how a man would treat his family by how he sharpened his tools." I did not have an answer for that, so I just kept filing. The rasp of the steel was the only sound in the yard, except for the occasional groan from Barnaby the mule, who was watching us from the corral with his chin resting on the top rail, looking as if he had some thoughts on my filing technique, but was too polite to share them. When the saw was sharp enough to cut paper, I stood up and went to the cottonwood log. It took me 10 minutes to cut it into 16-inch rounds, the clean yellow sawdust smelling of sweet sap and damp earth. I set the first round on end, placed my iron wedge in the center, and brought the heavy wooden beetle down with a solid, hollow thwack. The log split clean down the grain, falling into 2 perfect halves with a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet morning. Work is the only medicine that doesn't leave a bitter taste in the mouth. By noon, I had a cord of white oak and cottonwood stacked neatly against the south wall of her cabin, where the sun would keep it dry. She came out with a tin plate of cornbread and 2 mugs of tea made from wild rose hips. She had not forgotten the coffee, but she did not have any left, and she was too proud to mention it. "It is not much," she said, setting the plate on a clean, flat stump. "It is more than I had yesterday," I said. We ate standing up, the sun warming our faces while the wind took a holiday. "I saw Silas Vance in town yesterday," she said, after she had finished her bread. "He was at the Mercantile. He was talking to Mr. Gentry about my note." Silas Vance was Thomas's cousin, a man who owned a dry goods store and a small bank in Oak Haven, and who wore a black broadcloth coat even in July to show everyone he did not have to sweat for his bread. He was a small, neat man, with fingers that always looked as if they had just been washed in lard. "What did Silas have to say?" I asked. "He said he was concerned about my welfare," she said. Her voice had a dry, sarcastic edge that I had not heard before. "He said a woman alone on this creek is like a sheep in a wolf patch. He offered to buy the land for $300. He said it was a charitable offer, seeing as the cabin needs a new roof and the well is going sour." $300 is about half what the lumber in the cabin is worth, I said. "I know," she said, "but he told me that if the bank takes it, I will not get a nickel. He said the town is already talking about me." She looked down at her boots. One of them had a split along the welt where the dry grass had worn through the leather. "What are they saying, Clara?" "They are saying that a woman who spends 3 days in a line shack with a drift rider from the Circle 9 has no business running a respectable homestead," she said. Her voice was very quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the yard. Silas said it was a scandal. He said the church ladies are already talking about holding a meeting to discuss whether I should be allowed to keep the post office box in town. I felt a cold spot start in the middle of my back, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Silas Vance was the kind of man who would use a blizzard to steal a widow's garden patch if he thought he could get it for a nickel on the dollar. "He is a liar," I said. "He is a businessman," she corrected. "In this territory, they are usually the same thing." I set my tea mug down on the chopping block. "I have $80 in my box at the bunkhouse," I said. "It is not 300, but it will quiet the bank for 6 months." She looked at me, her eyes dark and steady under the brim of her old sunbonnet. "I cannot take your horse money, Jessie." "It is not horse money," I said. "It is just money." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You have been saving that since you came to this creek. I have seen you riding that 3-year-old gelding of Miller's, the one that tries to throw you every time you put a leg over him. You want your own horse. You want your own place." "I can wait," I said. "So can the bank," she said. "But they will wait with a sheriff's sale." She turned and went back into the house, leaving the plate and the mugs on the stump. I stood there for a long time, looking at the stack of fresh split oak. The wood was clean and white, the grain straight and honest, but it did not look like enough to keep the winter out anymore. 2 days later, Silas Vance rode into the yard. He was riding a sleek bay mare with a fancy double-rigged saddle, and he was wearing his black coat with a gray wool muffler wrapped twice around his neck. He looked at the stack of firewood, then at my horse, which was tied to the fence. I was in the middle of cleaning the muck out of her small barn, using a wooden fork to toss the wet straw into the corral. I did not stop when he rode in. I kept working, the steady scrape of the shovel against the oak floorboards making a sharp, rhythmic sound in the cold air. "Jessie," he said, staying in his saddle. "Vance," I said, without looking up. He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. "I see you are still making yourself useful around here," he said. "I am," I said. "The people in town are talking, Jessie. It is not seemly. A young man, unmarried, spending so much time on a widow's place. It sets a bad example for the younger folks." I stopped my shovel and leaned against the handle. I looked up at him, my hat pulled down low to keep the glare out of my eyes. "The only people talking in town are the ones who do not have enough work of their own to do, Vance." He colored up, his face turning a dark plum red above his gray muffler. I am her family, Jesse. I have a right to look after her interests. You have a right to try and steal her land, I said. That is about all the interest you have. He pulled on his reins, his bay mare stepping sideways in the frozen mud. I have a note on this property, he said, his voice rising. It is due on the 1st of December. If she does not have the $20, I will file the papers in the county seat on Monday morning. I have already spoken to the sheriff. Monday morning is 4 days off, I said. She does not have $20, Jesse. She does not even have 20 cents. She spent her last dollar on flour 3 weeks ago. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small leather pouch, and took out a gold double eagle. It was a $20 coin I had kept in my boot for 3 years, a piece of money my father had given me when I left Missouri. He had told me to keep it until I was either buying a home or burying a friend. I walked out of the barn, my boots sinking into the mud, and stood by his stirrup. I held the coin up between my thumb and forefinger. Here is your $20, Vance, I said. He looked at the gold piece, then at me. His eyes were small and dark, like 2 buckshot holes in a loaf of bread. This is your money, Jesse, not hers. The law does not care whose name is on the gold, I said. It only cares that the debt is paid. He did not take the coin. He sat there, his mouth working as if he had a sour plum in it. This does not change anything, he said. The mortgage is still there. The next payment is due in January. She cannot keep this up. She does not have to keep it up alone, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then reached down and snatched the gold piece from my fingers. He did not say thank you. He wheeled his bay mare around, splattering mud against the barn wall, and rode out of the gate at a trot. I watched him go until the road turned behind the hill. The yard was very quiet now. The wind had dropped again, and the sun was setting behind the bighorns, throwing long purple shadows across the white snow. I turned around and saw Clara standing by the kitchen door. She had her apron wrapped around her hands to keep them warm. She had heard every word. You should not have done that, Jesse, she said. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were bright. It was my money, I said. I can spend it how I like. It was your home money, she said. No, I told her, walking up to the porch. It was just $20. A home is not made out of gold, Clara. It is made out of something else. We stood there on the porch, the cold air settling down around us like a heavy blanket. That evening, we sat in the kitchen. The small stove was humming with a fresh charge of oak, and the room was warmer than the line shack had been. But the silence between us was different now. It was not the silence of 2 people waiting for a storm to pass. It was the silence of 2 people who had reached the end of their road and were looking at the map to see where it went next. The gray wool army blanket was lying on the kitchen table. Clara had taken it down from the line shack that afternoon and washed it in her tin tub. It was clean now, the smell of horse sweat and cedar smoke replaced by the fresh, sharp scent of yellow soap and cold well water. She had mended the small tear in the corner where my spur had caught it years ago, using a piece of dark blue thread that did not quite match but was strong enough to hold. I was sitting in her husband's old chair by the window, whittling a small peg for her pantry door. My hands were dirty from the barn work, but they were warm. Jesse, she said, looking at the blanket. Yes, Clara. Why did you hang it? I stopped my knife. The small pine shaving fell onto my boot. Hang what? The blanket, she said. In the shack. You did not have to. I was too cold to care about the town, and you knew it. I looked at her. Her face was in the shadow, but the firelight from the stove grate was reflecting off her dark eyes. You were a widow alone, Clara, I said, and I was a hired hand with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle. If I had not hung that blanket, you would have had to look at me every morning, and wonder if I was looking at you the same way Silas Vance looks at a piece of land he wants to buy. She did not say anything to that. She reached out and touched the gray wool, her fingers tracing the blue stripe down the center. A blizzard trapped us in the line shack 3 days, I said, and all we did was talk. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she smiled without any sadness in her eyes. I know, she said, and that is why I am letting you split my wood. I set my whittling down on the windowsill. I stood up and walked over to the table, but I did not cross the line where the blanket lay. I stood on my side of the pine table, and she stood on hers. I have $60 left in my box, Clara, I said. It is enough to buy 4 good heifers and a bull calf. If we put them on your 30 acres, we can make the payment in January without having to look at Silas Vance's face again. She looked down at her hands, then back at the blanket. And what do you want for your $60, Jessie? I do not want your land, I said, and I do not want your husband's house. I want to build a new room on the south side where the sun hits the window in the morning, and I want to do it with you. She did not answer right away. She stood there, her fingers still resting on the gray wool, her breathing steady and quiet in the warm kitchen. The silence went on for so long, I could hear the timber of the roof settling in the frost. The new room would need a stove, she said at last. I can find one, I told her. And a window, she said, a big one, so I can see the creek when the cottonwoods turn yellow in the fall. I can make that window, Clara. She looked up from the table, her eyes dark and wet. We will have to tell the town, she said. Silas will not keep quiet about the line shack. Let him talk, I said. A blizzard trapped us in the line shack 3 days, and all we did was talk. If they do not believe that, they do not know what a real storm is like. She reached across the table, her hand small and warm, and for the first time, she did not pull it back. I believe you, Jessie, she said. The first hard frost of December came on a Tuesday, but by then the new room was already framed up. The cedar posts were notched and pinned, and the scent of fresh-shaved pine was thick in the yard, sitting right next to the smell of the oak firewood stacked against the chimney. We did not have a big wedding. We rode into town on a Saturday morning, with Barnaby the mule pulling the wagon, because my horse had a stone bruise and could not carry a saddle. The preacher at the Methodist church did the business in 5 minutes, while his wife stood by the door and watched us with the curious, sharp eyes of a chicken looking for a beetle in the straw. She did not say anything about the line shack, but she did offer us a jar of pickled plums and told us that the winter was going to be a long one. We did not care about the winter. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the bighorns, turning the snow-covered prairie into a sheet of pink and gold that looked like the roses on her mother's Ohio carpet. I untied my bedroll and brought the gray wool army blanket inside. We did not hang it from the ceiling this time. We laid it across the bed in the new room, where the window looked out toward the creek and the cottonwoods. You don't always know the moment when the drifting ends. Sometimes you only know it looking back. But it ends.